Thank you, Dick. Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. I am not a geologist. So I really can't talk about oil and gas. This isn't working. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't talk about regulations. I'm not an economist, so I can't talk about jobs. I'm not a chemist, so I really can't talk about the drilling fluids. So I really shouldn't be here, and until Tuesday I wasn't going to be here. And even then, when they asked me to talk, they asked me to talk about fracking instead of the future of oil and gas. So it was a switch a couple times, but I'm here. I'll do my best. I don't think that we need treat fracking as a four-letter word. But I do think we need to be aware of the hyperbole and indeed the controversy on both sides of the issue, pro and con, because in many ways it is the future of oil and gas, not only in the United States, but in Canada and Mexico. And I'll get into some of the tri-national and trans-border issues. And then, of course, for you legislators, I think you need to understand this moment and understand your role. Otherwise, others will do it for you. I want to, like Dick said, give you kind of fracking 101, and then where we're talking about it, why it's an issue now, what are the issues, and what are some of the safeguards and benefits of the process. We call it fracturing, spelled F-R-A-C and F-R-A-C-K, and variously described. A lot of people think it's just for gas, or just for gas and oil, but people frack. They hydraulically frack the ground for water. We hydraulically frack the ground for heat and geothermal exploration. So it's not it's a lumping sum, but there's a lot of things going on when people talk about fracking. So when you all are legislating, be very clear about what you're legislating for. It is usually deep in the earth. I mean, he's talking about his oil being 2 miles underground. That's why you're drilling between 1 and 2 and 3, sometimes even deeper than that. And that tends to separate where the oil and the gas is from the water and the other resources that you want to keep free from contamination. And I'll revisit that issue in the end. We humans discovered fracturing because that's what nature does. I mean, that's what ice does every single day. Water percolates down. When it freezes, it fractures the ground. And so we're mimicking that when we put these fluids under pressure with some proppants under the ground to make it available. I do think a warning or a precaution would be, this is irreversible. Once you've fractured, you can't unfrack. So if there have been mistakes made, those are permanent mistakes. If there are risks, those will be permanent threats that will be exposed, would be my only admonition. So conventional oil and gas drilling goes for where there's huge pools of it. But there are places that's called tight or embedded or there's lots of ways of describing where this stuff is unavailable, and that's where you frack. So fracking is the process of, again, deeper and protected from these pressurized fluids escaping during their descent, putting holes in the drilling line and allowing this highly pressurized combinations of fluids and proppants to prop open existing cracks, make them larger so oil can be released, so gas can be released, so water, where you frack for water, can be released, where heat can be released. Pretty good graphic provided by the industry. Obviously, wells are much more productive. You're drilling down and you're drilling across. After you've got those available oil and gases, you can get more oil and gas by fracking. It is indeed the future. It'll make an unproductive well productive again. Of course there's going to be jobs. I mean, you've heard him talk about the jobs in the Dakotas that are being created by not just oil and gas, but by the fracking that goes with it. If you've got a wellhead on the surface, why drill another one someplace else? If you can horizontally drill and then frack deep and several miles from where that single footprint on the surface is. And you can do it for, indeed, our security, our energy security here in North America for the long term. As it turns out, about most oil and gas wells have been fracked. And it's become an issue recently because it's now economically very productive. Before it was on the margins. Now we found out through technology how to make fracking more productive. So it's being done in a lot of places. And I think you'll see every oil and gas well eventually want to frack. And so you're going to have to figure out, can you permit these safely? Fracking can occur in lots of different places. Again, a warning or advice would be, fracking in one place is not fracking in someplace else. Fracking in Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia is not the same as fracking in the Bakken. Fracking in California is not the same as fracking in Arkansas. Fracking in Oklahoma is not the same. But there are indeed active fracking going on in many places, some for gas, some for oil, some for both. So what are these fluids? What are we talking about when we talk about putting these proppants in the ground to fracture the rock? They are fluids, most of it water, and so it needs a lot of water. And so if water is a scarce resource, or if pollution of water is an issue in your state, that's one thing to think about. The proppants are 750 different compounds, chemicals, other fluids that are mixed with the water to prop open those cracks. Most of them are common. I mean, they're things like detergents and oils and diesel and biocides. I mean, the same biocides we use on the surface. Some of them are known health hazards, and then there's some of them we just don't know. So of the 750, you got to know that it's more than just a few things that we're putting down there. And we're putting them down at extraordinarily high pressures. So the safeguards that the oil industry has put in the descent of these pressurized fluids into depth in the cement casings are indeed safeguards, but we need some standards for these safeguards to make sure that they work. And then the amount of these fluids is high as well. I mean, we're putting an awful lot of these, sometimes, barrels a second into the ground. And then, of course, some of this is recovered and becomes a surface contaminant that needs to be disposed of. We got into this situation, or mess, if you want to call it that, because there have been exemptions in the rules over the years, lobbied for and gotten by the oil and gas industry. Some appropriate, some debatable, some maybe not. So the question becomes now, who is regulating this? The EPA regulates partially under RCRA and partially under NPDES, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, which means if that fluid comes back to the surface, you are not allowed to put it into a surface water body, flowing or not. You can't put it in a lake or stream without treatment. So in a lot of places, these fluids are going to water treatment plants. Now, is it appropriate for a water treatment plant that's set up to do sewage from homes and farms and industry to also take on these new chemicals? Is it appropriate for the discharge from some of these wastewater treatment plants to be going into international waters, the Great Lakes, the Colorado, the Rio Bravo? And of course, EPA regulates air quality laws, because you do have some methane coming out of the ground as well. There is some state regulation on the conduct of fracking, and sometimes in some states there are overlapping agencies that have jurisdiction over some of the fracking itself. And then there is inconsistency, wide inconsistency from state to state. So one of the points I'll make now, and I'll make it again at the end, is if some of the regions can get together and almost like an interstate compact agree that your basins are very similar, your geology is very similar, your issues are very similar, maybe you want to set up similar legislation, you can compare and contrast and maybe even adopt regional rules rather than state by state by state, where it's going to be harder to monitor, implement, etc. So I did a real quick survey. There's 10 states that are not doing anything at all because they typically don't have oil and gas exploration. Do they need it? I don't know. There's one state where it's a corporation commission. I don't know if all corporation commissions are in the business of promoting jobs, but in this state it may be the case. 8 states have the environmental agency responsible for overviewing fracking? Are they too environmentally sensitive? In 15 states, it's the Lands Commission. Typically, lands commissions are like oil and gas commissions. That's why they're called lands commissions. They understand the geology. They're also called the geology commissions or the minerals commissions or the mining commission or something. And then the 16 states that have oil and gas commissions probably do understand the oil and gas industry and the evolution of fracking over the years, and maybe are the most knowledgeable. But again, there's a lot of inconsistency and differences from state to state. So what assurance does the public have that methane and these fluids are being contained? I know there's people who discount science, but I mean, it's the best that we have. The U.S. government invests in the National Academy of Science to tell us their best assessment with the best experts in the world. Not people like me, but people who really understand geology and the industry and the fluids. And they conclude that greater stewardship is probably needed to make sure that the public has confidence, because right now, the public lacks the confidence that perhaps they need for the issue. A few specifics that I found. Earthquakes, they may not be big, but USGS, who is our earthquake experts, tell us that fracking causes earthquakes. It's probably the one reason that in a few places there is a moratorium on fracking until the issue can be resolved. And these are direct quotes from USGS. It's an issue now because, like I said, everyone wants to frack. They can make their wells more productive. So in 2004, I mean, long time ago, I mean, in the age of fracking, 2004 was an eon ago. They did report that in places where you're trying to get methane out of the coal beds, fracking was exposing methane to the water table. And so if you've seen Gasland, the movie, you know, the guy lights his water faucet, and it's real impressive. But how do we know that didn't exist before there was fracking? Because the water table and the gas tables are mixed. You often have this, and it's one reason the EPA was precluded from regulating in this issue, because you've got the mixing of these gases and waters underground. So when people are drilling wells, they get it. The best way to know this is what I call a before-after control experimental group. You need to look at what happened before fracking, what happened after fracking, in a control situation and an experimental situation. And some of these scientific reports by MIT and Duke did that. They were before, after controlled and experimental situations, but they were looking at it. So I think we have to pay attention to when they do that. And then the EPA is now finding phthalates and methane in some of the fluids in some of the wells and some of the fluids that they're bringing back up. So the footprint, this was a footprint in, I think, Arkansas before and after the oil well and the fracking and the disposal of the fluids or the retention of the fluids that are created by this. And if they're recycling the fluids, you've got to consider the footprint for the recycling of the fluids before you're putting them back in the ground. So it's not a trivial issue. Water use, this is actually this is Canada. But Canada is concerned about discharge of wastewater treatment plant into the common lakes, and Canada is concerned about withdrawals from the Great Lakes for fracking, because again, we're talking about a lot of water. So it becomes international very quickly. Safeguards. Okay, the industry has done, I think, a good job of establishing there are safeguards. When you're doing the fracking, you can, with geophones that listen and tilt meters that tell you if there's been movement, figure out if places have been disturbed, fractured where you didn't anticipate it or necessarily want it. So with that information, you can, and the public can know, if indeed there are opportunities for contamination. And they're monitoring the gases that come up. Obviously they have to. And then they are recovering these fluids, trying to retain them, trying to recycle those that they have to. But again, in places they have permits to discharge to wastewater treatment plants. Okay, this is that safeguard I was talking about, the casings. When you're when the fluids are descending, these barrels and barrels of fluids that are descending thousands of feet, you want to encase that so it's not just metal holding it in, but it's a system of safeguards to make sure it doesn't get exposed to drinking water or any of the permeable geology that's above the line where you're separating it. So to me, kind of as a novice, as someone who's just looking at this from a public and a transboundary perspective, a lot of this has to do with the depth. And if indeed you can separate your drinking water from the fracking by thousands of feet and lots of different layers, then there's probably a high probability that you have separation, you have buffering, you've got the assurance that you have. But the only way to really know that is to do the geology in 3 dimensions, to do the geology over a distance so that if you're fracking at depth, you know how far that fracking is going to occur horizontally, you know how far that fracking is going to occur vertically, and you will have some better sense based on the geology of where the fracking can expose a problem. France declared a moratorium. Quebec, because of earthquakes, declared a moratorium. New South Wales, Karoo in South Africa. And then I'm told by the program that New Jersey has a moratorium, New York has a moratorium, and Arkansas has banned the use of injection wells because of the wastewater. I didn't know that, didn't find that in my work. So again, I go back to the point that if there are indeed best management practices that industry has come up with, and those aren't on your books, you may want to, with your neighboring states, figure out what makes sense as a regional best management practice for industry and regulate that, monitor that. You may want to mandate that. Active monitoring, active water retention, recycling. And I would watch, if I were you, I would watch what the Secretary of Energy is doing because he's been assigned by the President to see what the federal role is. Now, let me close with 2 days ago, U.S. EPA has decided it will issue rules, and that doesn't mean that rules take part. It just means they're going to issue hypothetical standards for the public to consider for NPDES. In other words, is the EPA going to preclude fracking fluids from being allowed into water treatment plants? Primary, secondary, tertiary, doesn't matter. EPA will decide. So if you don't want the EPA deciding that issue for you, you may want to decide it yourself preemptively. Thanks for your time.